On the night that was supposed to seal a destiny of luxury and power, a bride decides to transform her own wedding into an escape, risking everything for freedom. On the other side, a powerful sheik sees his honor shattered before everyone and begins a relentless pursuit driven by pride, pain, and a past that still haunts him. Between the desert and a new identity, she experiences for the first time the taste of choice. Without imagining that she is being watched and hunted without rest. When the two finally meet again, it is not just a confrontation, it is the clash between freedom and possession, between fear and a dangerous tension that neither of them can control. Before diving into this intense story full of twists, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any surprising accounts like this one. The hot desert wind entered through the cracks of the high windows, lightly moving the white silk curtains that hung from the ceiling to the polished marble floor. On that night, Al-Rashid Palace seemed larger than ever, its corridors lit by hundreds of candles arranged in gold candlesticks that reflected the light at multiple angles, creating dancing shadows on the walls covered in turquoise and gold mosaic. It was a night that should be celebrated, a night of feast, of unions and promises sealed before God and men. But for Layla Hassan, that night had the bitter taste of defeat. She was sitting before a gold-framed mirror, with her hands resting on her lap, observing her own reflection with an expression that mixed resignation and something very similar to contained fury. Her dark skin contrasted with the white of the embroidered dress that covered her shoulders in layers of imported fabric, and her dark eyes, lined with kohl traced with the precision of a ritual, seemed to hold a storm that had not yet broken. Behind her, an older woman adjusted the final details of the veil with experienced fingers, murmuring words of encouragement that Layla pretended not to hear. She was 26 years old, had a degree in business administration from the American University of Dubai, an old dream of opening her own fashion atelier, and an entire life planned in her own way, with choices that would be exclusively hers. All of this had been placed in the background by the agreement that her father, Ibrahim Hassan, had negotiated over months with Khalid al-Rashid, the most influential sheik in the region of Al-Dhafra. The marriage was a matter of interest, of alliance between clans, of old family debts that needed to be sealed with name and honor. And the price of that peace had been Layla. She had never managed to convince her father that this union was wrong. Ibrahim was a man of deep traditions, a man who sincerely believed that a daughter's duty was to honor the family, that love was something built afterward, not before, that time and coexistence transformed arrangements into affection. He had not been cruel in making that decision. He had been in his own way, simply incapable of seeing beyond what he had always known, and it was precisely this blindness, gentle and firm at the same time, that had placed Layla in that chair before that mirror, on that night when everything was supposed to begin, and which she had decided, with a clarity that was frightening, would be the end of something very different. The ceremony had been short and formal, conducted by an imam with a deep voice before a room filled with men in white turbans and women covered in jewels that sparkled under the lights of immense chandeliers. Khalid al-Rashid had stood by her side throughout the ritual, tall, imposing, with a face of hard features and amber-colored eyes that swept the room with the coldness of one who evaluates assets, not people. He had not addressed more than 3 words to her during the entire ceremony. He had not smiled. He had not made any gesture that suggested he saw in her anything beyond a fulfilled commitment, a closed obligation. At the banquet that followed, Layla had remained seated at the head table, surrounded by women who spoke of expensive fabrics, children, and international trips, while she felt the weight of that new ring on her finger as if it were an iron shackle. Khalid had circulated among the guests with the natural authority of someone who has always been at the center of every space he inhabited, receiving compliments with a slight nod of the head, speaking little and with surgical precision, never looking in her direction long enough for any observer to call it interest or tenderness. It was at this banquet that the moment occurred which confirmed for Layla everything she had feared. One of Khalid's advisors had approached him discreetly and whispered something in his ear. Khalid's reaction had been immediate and completely controlled, but Layla was close enough to see the coldness that had taken over his eyes, the jaw that had tightened almost imperceptibly. He had responded to the advisor with 2 dry words, and then turned back to the group of guests around him as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and that coldness, that ability to switch off any emotion in a fraction of a second, as if feelings were just noise to be silenced, had chilled Layla's stomach in a way she couldn't precisely name, but which she instinctively recognized as real danger. Now, back in the room that had been assigned to her in the east wing of the palace, she observed her reflection and made a decision that had been fermenting inside her since that morning when she had woken up with a heavy heart and the certainty that she could not get through that night without acting. The bedroom door was closed with a thick bolt. Outside, 2 guards patrolled the corridor at regular intervals, as she had been informed by the maid who had helped her prepare. The palace was vast, with dozens of corridors, internal staircases and passages that she obviously knew nothing about. It was a labyrinth built to contain, not to release. But there was one person who knew every inch of that place. Amira, the maid assigned to accompany her during that transition week, was a woman in her late 40s, of Moroccan origin, with sharp eyes that caught everything around her and a loyalty that seemed directed not to the Sheik who employed her, but to Layla, with whom she had exchanged only a few hours of conversation and already showed a silent solidarity that went beyond any professional obligation. Amira had said one sentence while adjusting Layla's dress before the ceremony, a sentence that remained engraved like a veiled promise. In this house, those who know how to walk in the dark go far. Layla rose from the chair with precise and silent movements. She carefully removed the veil and folded it over the bed, as if she were leaving there the last piece of a life she had decided not to live. She went to the window and looked at the palace's inner garden, lit by wrought-iron lanterns among palms aligned with geometric perfection, with a circular fountain whose murmur reached her like a whisper of complicity. Beyond the palace walls, the desert stretched under a sky of stars as dense as sand, scattered in the infinite darkness. There was a city 40 kilometers away. There was an entire world she had not yet had the chance to know on her own terms, with her own choices, with her own name spoken by her own voice, without someone before her having decided what that name should mean. She went to the side door of the room, the one that led not to the main corridor, but to a small closet with walls covered in shelves and another discreet exit, and knocked 3 times softly, the signal she had arranged with Amira earlier, during the few minutes they had been alone while everyone else prepared for the banquet. The door opened slowly, and Amira's face appeared in the crack with watchful eyes and the calm expression of someone who had been waiting for this much longer than just tonight. Layla didn't need to say anything. Amira opened the door a bit more, checked the surroundings with a quick and sure glance, and said almost without a voice, with a gentle urgency that sounded like protection, "I know a way, but we need to go now before the guards change shifts." Layla took only what she had hidden under the mattress that afternoon: her documents, a reasonable amount of money exchanged into cash by Amira without anyone knowing, and a small memory card with files that might one day be important. Everything else would stay behind. The ring would stay on the bed beside the carefully folded veil, as the most honest and silent answer she could give to that night, and to that man who had never bothered to learn the sound of her name. The corridor was narrow and smelled of cold stone, completely different from the perfumed marble of the palace's main wings. Amira advanced in front, carrying a small lantern covered with a dark cloth that let out only a sliver of light sufficient to guide their steps without drawing attention. Layla followed her closely, her heart racing but her steps deliberately silent, stepping where Amira stepped, stopping when Amira stopped, breathing deeply every time they heard a distant sound coming from the main corridors. The passage had been built generations ago, Amira explained in fragmented whispers as they advanced, originally to allow servants to move through the palace without crossing paths with family members. Over time, it had been forgotten by the owners and remembered only by the oldest employees, those who had served Khalid's father and his grandfather before that. Amira was one of those people. She had arrived at the palace while still young, coming from Morocco through an employment agency that no longer existed today, and had spent the last 20 years learning every angle, every sound, and every silence of that place. She knew where the cameras had blind spots. She knew at which point in the garden the exterior lighting regularly failed. She knew that the night watch changed at 10 p.m., and that there was an interval of about 12 minutes when the southern sector of the wall was without direct coverage. In those 12 minutes, they had to cross the side garden, scale a low section of the support wall that led to the service road, and reach the vehicle that Amira had asked a cousin to park 300 meters away, under the shadow of a row of acacias growing along the road that led to the city of Madinat Zayed. The plan was simple because it had to be. Anything more elaborate would have more points of failure. And Layla, with all her academic training in risk management, perfectly understood this principle, as she applied it to her own escape on a night of a thin moon over the desert of the United Arab Emirates. They reached the end of the inner corridor, and Amira pushed a heavy wooden door that opened to the side garden with an almost imperceptible creak. The hot night air rushed in at once, laden with the scent of jasmine flowers growing along the wall, and Layla closed her eyes for just a second to feel that smell, to remember that there was a real world beyond the golden corridors of that place. Then she opened her eyes and followed Amira through the garden in quick, silent steps, staying in the shadow of the palms, avoiding the lanterns lit along the stone paths. The section of wall Amira had indicated was a structural lowering in the oldest part of the complex, where the stone had yielded slightly over the years, and no one had bothered to restore it because it was in an area rarely frequented and without monitoring cameras in that specific sector. It was less than 1.5 meters high at that point. Amira made a basket with her interlaced hands, and Layla leaned on them, lifting her body more easily than she expected, thanks to the years of yoga classes her mother had insisted she attend, and descended on the other side with her feet in the compacted sand of the service road. Amira would not come with her. That had been the agreement. If both disappeared, suspicion would immediately fall on the maid. But if Amira remained, she could plausibly deny any involvement and protect herself. Layla had resisted this, saying it wasn't fair that she couldn't accept Amira risking her situation for her. Amira had responded with a quiet firmness that silenced any objection. "You are not doing this just for yourself. Every woman who manages to get out opens a path that didn't exist before." On the other side of the wall, Layla looked at Amira's silhouette still visible atop the stone, illuminated by that sky full of stars that seemed like a promise. Amira made a brief gesture with her hand, something between a wave and a blessing, and then retreated into the shadows of the garden without making a sound. The vehicle was exactly where it had been promised, an old utility vehicle, sand-colored, with a man in a white turban at the wheel who didn't say a word besides Madinat Zayed as Layla got in and closed the door. The road was flat and empty at that hour, cutting through the desert in a straight line under that immense sky. Layla leaned her head against the window and watched the stars as the vehicle moved forward, trying to organize her thoughts, trying to calculate what would come next, and realizing that the sensation she felt in her chest was not fear, but something that had been suffocated for so long that it took a few minutes to recognize. It was relief. In Madinat Zayed, Amira's cousin dropped her off near the bus station with an envelope containing more money that Amira had prepared days in advance, and left without asking questions. Layla bought a ticket to Abu Dhabi with cash, using a document with her maiden name that was still valid, and which Amira had kept along with the other papers. The bus was leaving in 40 minutes. She went into the station bathroom, changed the ceremonial dress for a simple outfit that was folded inside a plastic bag Amira had hidden with the documents, and looked at herself in the stained mirror above the sink. Without the veil, without the jewels, without the embroidered dress, she looked like another person. She looked like herself. She wiped the kohl from her eyes with cold water, leaving her face clean and unornamented, and realized that the woman in the mirror had an expression that the reflection in the palace had never shown. Determination. The bus left on time. Layla watched through the window as the small city lights disappeared behind and the open desert road stretched ahead. She didn't know exactly what awaited her. She didn't have a plan beyond the next few hours, but she knew, with a certainty she felt in her bones, that every kilometer the bus advanced was a kilometer between her and that ring left on the bed, between her and that man with amber eyes who had looked at her and seen only a fulfilled agreement. What she didn't know was that at that same moment, 40 kilometers behind her, all the lights of Al Rashid Palace were on. Khalid al-Rashid was standing in the center of the empty room, looking at the ring on the bed, next to the veil folded with a care that seemed too intentional to be carelessness. There was something in the gesture that disturbed him in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't anger yet, though anger would come. It was something prior to anger, something more primitive and more silent, like the moment before a sandstorm when the wind stops completely and the air becomes too still to be natural. His advisors waited in the corridor. One of them had knocked on the bedroom door 20 minutes ago, had found the room empty, and had come to inform him with the expression of one awaiting punishment for being the messenger of news he himself had not caused. Khalid had listened in silence. He had ordered the men to check the perimeter. He had stayed alone in the room for 5 minutes. That felt longer than that. He picked up the ring between his fingers and examined it for a moment. Then he placed it in the inner pocket of his kandura with a gesture that seemed definitive and cold as steel. He turned toward the door and said, with a voice that did not rise in volume but filled the entire room, "Find her." Abu Dhabi woke up early, with movement that began before the sun fully appeared on the horizon, when the first merchants opened their stalls at the central market and the smell of Arabic coffee with cardamom began to spread through the alleys near the Corniche. Layla arrived in the city at 4 in the morning with a small bag and the strange sensation of being at once free and completely helpless. Two things that she discovered at that moment could inhabit the same body at the same time without contradicting each other. She had planned only the first few hours clearly. There was an address that Amira had written on a tiny scrap of paper and that Layla had memorized before destroying it. A small hotel in the old part of the city, discreet, frequented by workers and travelers passing through, far from the luxury hotels where any familiar face might recognize her. The hotel was called Al-Nakhla, had a worn tile facade, and a sleepy receptionist who took the cash without asking questions and handed her an old metal key with a yellow plastic keychain. The room was small and simple, with a single bed, a window overlooking an alley and a ceiling fan that spun with a regular hum. Layla placed the bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the fan for a long moment, letting the hum fill her. It was the first true silence she had experienced in weeks, without her father's voice explaining why this was necessary, without the aunt's voices describing the groom's qualities, without the banquet music and the voices of guests she had not chosen to have around. Just the fan and the alley down there and herself, intact, breathing. She slept for 5 hours and woke up with a hunger that seemed to come from days ago. She went down to the corner, bought pita bread and hummus from a small counter on the sidewalk, and ate standing up, watching the street movement, observing people pass by with the sharpened attention of someone beginning to learn that anonymity is a precious asset that must be actively cultivated. No one looked at her. No one recognized her. In that neighborhood, she was simply a young woman in simple clothes eating bread on the sidewalk, one among thousands. In the following days, she worked methodically. She opened an account at a smaller credit union, using valid documents that were still in her maiden name. She sent a coded message to a college friend named Rania, who lived in Dubai and was the only person besides Amira she trusted completely, informing her that she was well and needed time. Rania had responded only with a moon emoji, which was the code they had agreed upon years ago to say the message had been received, and there was no need for more words. After a week in Abu Dhabi, Layla realized she needed to keep moving. The city was large but not large enough, and she had crossed paths with 2 family acquaintances in public spaces she frequented, situations she had managed to avoid by luck and instinct, but which clearly signaled she needed more geographical distance and a more solid cover. Rania, through careful messages, had informed her that Layla's name was circulating in family conversations with an urgency that grew every day. It was Rania who suggested Sharjah, not the tourist part or the commercial part, but a residential neighborhood in the interior of the city where a recently opened cafe was looking for employees. The owner, a woman named Nadia, was a distant acquaintance of Rania, someone Rania spoke of as being discreet, fair, and not in the habit of asking unnecessary questions about the personal lives of those who worked for her. The cafe was called Bab al-Ward, the Gate of Roses, and it was on a quiet street near a park. Layla arrived in Sharjah on a Thursday afternoon, with a backpack larger than the bag she had left Abu Dhabi with, and her hair tied in a low bun, which, combined with a pair of light prescription glasses she had bought at a pharmacy, subtly altered the immediate impression she made. They weren't elaborate disguises. They were just adjustments to what already existed, layers of simplicity over an appearance that the glamorous world of the palace had tried to transform into a symbol of possession. Nadia was exactly as Rania had described, a woman in her 40s with short-cut hair and calloused hands of someone who worked alongside the team, not above it. She had looked at Layla with attention during the quick interview they did at one of the cafe's tables before opening hours, had asked 3 practical questions about customer service and cashier experience, had listened to the answers without interrupting them, and then had said simply, "You start Monday." The life Layla built in the following weeks was different from anything she had known before, and that was exactly why it began, timidly, to feel like hers. She woke up early, walked to the cafe through the park, had the first coffee of the day before the customers arrived, worked 6 hours per shift, and returned to the small apartment she had rented within a week above a stationery store. She learned the names of the regular customers, learned the coffees each preferred, learned the difference between a silence that asked for company and a silence that asked to be respected. It was in this rhythm that she had learned, almost without noticing, to note the presence of Tariq. He had appeared for the first time on a Tuesday morning, had ordered a double coffee without sugar, had sat near the window with a black-covered notebook, and had stayed there for 2 hours writing without breaks. He hadn't looked at her more than once. On Wednesday he had returned, on Thursday as well. On Friday he had left a generous tip and said thank you in a quiet voice, as if thank you were a word he used with attention, not out of habit. Layla had learned to distrust male attention for obvious reasons, but there was something in the discreet way Tariq occupied the space that was different from anything she associated with danger. He didn't watch her. He was always absorbed in his own business. His presence was, strangely, part of what made the cafe mornings slightly easier to get through. What she hadn't realized yet was that 3 tables away on a Saturday morning, a man with a phone in his hand had taken a discreet photograph and was sending it to a number he hadn't saved with a name in his contacts. That same afternoon, Layla left the cafe at the usual time, passed the corner fruit stand where the vendor already knew she preferred the smaller, sweeter pomegranates, and climbed the stairs to the apartment with the satisfying feeling of someone who had accumulated honest hours of work in something she chose. She had placed a small plant in the apartment window that week, a succulent with thick leaves that needed little water and much light, and had stared at it for a few minutes before sleeping, thinking it was the first living thing besides herself that she had cared for that was completely her responsibility. There was something in that idea that seemed important, though she couldn't yet articulate exactly what. That night she didn't dream of the palace. It was the first night that had happened since she had arrived in Sharjah, and she woke up the next day with the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to build something from that point. What she didn't know yet was how long that point would last. Khalid al-Rashid was not a man accustomed to waiting. He had grown up in a family where waiting was a sign of weakness, where hesitation was interpreted as doubt, and doubt as a lapse of character. His father, Sheik Hassan al-Rashid, had spent decades building a name that was synonymous with authority and decision in the context of the interior tribes of the Emirates, and had passed on to his eldest son, not just the wealth, but the philosophy that had built it: he who waits loses. Therefore, in the days following the night he found the empty room and the ring on the bed, Khalid had acted with the cold efficiency of someone solving an administrative problem. He had discreetly mobilized a network of contacts. He had instructed his trusted men to check possible routes from the palace. He had asked direct questions to every palace employee about what they had seen or heard that night, and had obtained answers that, added up, pointed in the correct direction, with a precision he knew was providence. What Khalid had not anticipated was how that situation would affect him internally. He had expected to feel anger, and anger had come, of course, but there was something else beneath it that he recognized and despised at the same time: curiosity. There was something about that woman who had left by her own decision, who had planned the escape with enough intelligence and calm to execute it on her own wedding night, that intrigued him in a way he preferred not to examine too closely. But there was something more than curiosity. There was a wound that gesture had opened without knowing it existed. An old wound, prior to Layla, prior to the arranged marriage, dating back to another woman, another departure, another night he had been left alone in a room that should have been shared. Dalia bint Khalid, his fiancée from 6 years ago, had left in another way, not by fleeing, but by a gradual renunciation that he had interpreted too late through signs he had never learned to read. The medallion he carried in the inner pocket of his kandura had been hers, a gift she had returned one silent morning, saying only that he had never truly looked at her. Khalid had kept the medallion not as a sentimental souvenir, but as a reminder that he should never again let something or someone slip through his hands due to lack of attention. It was a lesson learned the wrong way, but it was the only one he had managed to extract from that loss. The information arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a photograph taken in a cafe in Sharjah, featuring a woman who matched the description of Layla Hassan. The face was partially obscured by glasses she clearly didn't wear before, and her hair was different. But there was something in the posture, in the way she tilted her head slightly while working, that he recognized with a certainty that required no further confirmation. He had looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he had folded the paper and placed it in his pocket next to the medallion. He arrived in Sharjah on a Friday without visible security, in common clothes that made him anonymous on the street, something he rarely needed or wanted to be. He had asked a single trusted man to accompany him at a distance. The street where the cafe was located was quiet, tree-lined, with a park in the background that let in a breeze that softened the afternoon heat. He entered Bab al-Ward at 4 p.m., when the movement was slowing down, and sat at a table near the entrance. The cafe had a good smell, of cardamom and vanilla, and was decorated with hand-painted tiles that reminded him of southern Morocco. It was a place with its own character, different from any establishment he usually frequented, and he noticed this with something approaching surprise. Layla came out of the kitchen with 2 cups for a back table and saw him the instant she raised her eyes to sweep the room, as she had learned to do by habit since arriving there. The impact was so sudden that she almost stopped completely mid-step, but she didn't stop. She kept walking to the table with the cups, placed them in front of the customers with a smile that curved her lips, but didn't reach her eyes, and returned behind the counter with steps that seemed normal to any observer, and which cost her a conscious effort she had never needed to employ just to walk. He was looking at her, not with the coldness of the banquet, not with the indifference of the ceremony. He was looking with an attention that was different from anything she had associated with that face until then, and that was, in a specific and disturbing way, more frightening than indifference. Nadia was in the kitchen. There were 3 other customers in the lounge. Layla stayed behind the counter, picked up a glass, and began to clean it unnecessarily, and thought quickly. She could leave through the back door. She could ask Nadia to say she had already left. She could simply ignore him and wait for him to go away. But then Khalid rose from the table and walked toward the counter with slow and direct steps, and she realized that none of those options were real because he had already arrived and was on the other side of the wooden counter with those amber eyes that now looked at her in a way she couldn't completely avoid, and said in a low voice that didn't rise above the level of a private conversation, "You are not going anywhere before hearing me." Layla placed the glass on the counter with calculated care and responded with a calm that surprised even herself. "You are in no position to tell me where I go or don't go." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Khalid al-Rashid experienced something he hadn't felt in many years. He didn't know what to do next, but the moment lasted only those 3 seconds, because next the trusted man who had stayed outside entered discreetly and touched Khalid's shoulder, and Khalid responded to the touch with a minimal hand gesture that Layla couldn't interpret, but which clearly meant some instruction. Nadia had appeared at the kitchen door with an expression of interrogation in her eyes upon seeing that imposing-looking man behind her cafe's counter. Layla looked at Nadia. Nadia looked at Layla. There was a question in Nadia's eyes asking if she should intervene, and there was an answer in Layla's eyes saying no, not now, not like this, that she needed to resolve this another way. Khalid looked at her again and said, with that same low and precise voice, You can come voluntarily or I can wait until you have no choice. I prefer the first option. Layla felt anger rise with a force she had to actively hold back to not let it take over her voice when she replied, "The second option never existed, but you can wait as long as you want while I finish my shift." And she turned her back on him, took the order from a table that had arrived, and walked to the kitchen with steps that were, she knew, and he likely knew as well, the most eloquent form of refusal she could express at that moment without turning it into a public scene. Khalid stared at the kitchen door for a moment. Then he returned to the table, ordered a coffee from the employee who had remained in the lounge, and waited. What Layla didn't know, and what he also hadn't anticipated, was that silent wait before a cup of coffee in a neighborhood cafe would be the first time in years that Khalid al-Rashid had waited for anything without feeling anger. The return to the palace was not as Layla had imagined in her worst scenarios. There were no violent scenes in the street, no shouting, no public humiliation she had feared. Khalid had waited until the end of the shift, had left the cafe after her, and had simply walked by her side on the sidewalk as if they were two people who knew each other and needed to talk, with the trusted man maintaining a discreet distance behind them. But there was something in the way he walked by her side, how he gently blocked any change of route she attempted, how the vehicle was parked exactly in the direction they were walking. That made the situation absolutely clear. She was not leaving of her own free will. She was being led back by a pressure that didn't need physical force to be real. In the vehicle, the silence between them was thick. Layla looked out the window during most of the journey, refusing to start a conversation that felt like a concession. Khalid stayed on the other side of the back seat, also looking forward, with that medallion visible between his fingers for a moment before disappearing again into his pocket. And she noticed that object for the first time with involuntary curiosity. He was the one who spoke first, when the city of Sharjah was already behind them, and the desert opened up on both sides of the road. "You could have told me you didn't want this marriage before the ceremony happened." Layla turned her head to him with an expression that combined incredulity and deep exhaustion. "I told my father for 3 months. He didn't listen. Do you think it would have been different if I had told you?" Khalid didn't answer immediately. He kept looking at the road and then said, "I don't know." It was an honesty she hadn't expected, and she stayed silent for a moment, not knowing what to do with that answer. Back at the palace, Layla was installed not in the wedding night room, but in a larger set of quarters on the upper floor, with a balcony overlooking the garden with the fountain. The door was not locked from the outside. There was a different maid, a woman named Hessa, young and silent, who brought her tea without milk and asked if she wanted something to eat. Layla asked only for water and sat on the balcony looking at the garden, trying to understand what that return meant and what would come next. What came next was a conversation that happened the following day, in a formal sitting room with 2 dark green velvet sofas, separated by a low wooden table with mother-of-pearl inlays, as if there were a specific protocol for conversations between married people who behaved like strangers. Khalid arrived punctually without advisors, which was, Layla had learned, a way of saying he considered it a private matter. He said he understood she hadn't wanted the marriage. He said he hadn't intended to force her presence that night. He said he had behaved distantly at the banquet because he had had an urgent business matter he hadn't been able to put aside mentally, and that it had been a mistake to let that show on that occasion. All of this was said with an articulated precision that seemed rehearsed. But there was something in the way he didn't completely look away that suggested it wasn't entirely performance. Layla listened to everything. Then she said, "You said what you wanted to say. Now can you hear me?" He tilted his head slightly. She said she hadn't left on a whim or out of fear of obligations. She had left because that marriage had been built on the premise that she had no will of her own that needed to be consulted, and that she couldn't build a life within that premise without losing who she was. She said there was nothing he could offer within those walls that was worth more than the ability to wake up in the morning and make choices that were exclusively hers. Khalid listened to her without interrupting. And when she finished, he was silent for a time that was not the silence of someone ignoring, but of someone truly processing what he heard. Then he said with a voice slightly different from what he had used until then, less formal, What did you want to be before all this happened? The question was simple and completely unexpected, and Layla felt it like a small crack in a wall she had carefully built. She replied almost without thinking, "A designer. I have a project I could never develop because every time I tried, there was something else being decided for me." Something passed through Khalid's eyes that she couldn't completely name before he looked away. He said, "You can work here. There is a space in the palace that is not used. I can make it available to you." Layla stared at him. "It doesn't work that way," she said finally. "Work isn't a concession someone gives me. It's something I do because it's mine." And there was that silence again, in which Khalid didn't know what to say, and Layla realized with a complex mix of emotions she preferred not to examine closely, that this man who had seemed so absolutely impenetrable on the wedding night was, before her, visibly trying to learn a language he had never needed to speak before. The question was whether that mattered. The question was whether the effort, even if real, changed anything fundamental about the situation she was still in, within those walls that remained walls regardless of whether the door was locked or not. That afternoon, Tariq passed by the street in front of Bab al-Ward Cafe and asked Nadia where the employee was who had disappeared without notice. Nadia replied that she didn't know. Tariq stood looking at the table near the window where he had spent so many mornings writing with his double coffee without sugar, and felt something that was hard to name, but was clearly not just the lack of good coffee. That night, Layla stayed on the palace balcony until late, listening to the murmur of the fountain below and looking at the stars with the same intensity she had observed them from the bus window that had left Madinat Zayed weeks ago. The difference was that this time the stars seemed closer and more indifferent at the same time, as if the universe were pointing out to her the exact distance between where she was and where she wanted to be, without any judgment, without any instruction, letting her decide for herself what to do with that measurement. She had told Khalid that work was not a concession. It had been the truest thing she had said that day, but there was an adjacent truth she hadn't yet articulated even to herself, that there was something in that man, beneath all the armor of authority and coldness built over years, that she had not yet fully seen, and that a part of her, small but insistent like the succulent in the apartment window she had left behind in Sharjah, wanted to know what was there. That part she decided that night to keep in silence. In the days that followed, the palace gradually revealed its contradictory nature to Layla. It was vast and silent and oppressive in the formal corridors, but there were unexpected corners where life happened with a normalcy she hadn't anticipated. The large and bustling kitchen in the early morning hours, with the smell of fresh bread from the oven and employees talking in Arabic mixed with Urdu and Tagalog. The garden in moments of soft wind, where the palms made that sound of flipping pages. The library on the upper floor that had more novels than she had expected to find in a businessman's palace, with notes in the margins in small handwriting that were evidently not Khalid's, but which she had not yet asked whose they were. Khalid had given her freedom of movement within the palace and access to the garden. He had said she could use the car with a driver when she needed, with prior notice. He hadn't mentioned explicit restrictions, but the implicit structure was clear. She could move within a radius he had defined, without him ever having to say aloud that he had defined it. It was a gentle and intelligent prison, and Layla recognized it as such precisely because there was enough intelligence on both sides that neither needed to name what was happening. She had begun using the library space to work on the projects she had carried on the memory card. Fashion collection sketches she had developed during college years and after, projects that had stalled for lack of time, resources, or tacit permission from a family that thought fashion was a hobby, not a career. There, alone among the wooden shelves with that specific smell of paper and golden dust, she had opened the files and begun working on them again, with a concentration that seemed easier than she had expected. Khalid had passed by the library door one afternoon and found her there with her computer open and a series of printed sketches spread across the table. He had stopped at the threshold for a moment, observed the scene without entering, and left without saying anything. Layla had heard the footsteps receding and had stared at the screen for an instant, thinking about that silence, which seemed different from his other silences, less calculated, closer to something she still couldn't name. The tension between them grew in ways that were not violent, but were constant, like a rope being pulled from both sides with different forces. At a dinner where they had eaten in the same room for the first time, Khalid had made an observation about fashion market trends in the Emirates that revealed a knowledge of the subject she clearly hadn't expected, and she had responded with more detail than she had planned, and they had stayed in a 40-minute conversation about creativity, market and cultural identity that ended abruptly when both realized they had forgotten to maintain distance. There were also confrontations. On a morning when she had requested the car to go to a fabric store without prior notice from the day before, the driver had received instructions that he would need confirmation before any departure, an instruction that had clearly come from Khalid, and she had gone to his office on the ground floor and knocked on the door with more force than intended. The conversation that followed had been direct and at moments tense, with Layla saying that this type of control disguised as protocol was exactly what she hadn't been able to accept, and Khalid responding that there were security issues she was ignoring, and she asking from whom exactly, and him staying silent for 2 seconds before saying there were people he had displeased over the years, and that she could be used as a form of pressure by those people if there were no care. It was the first time he had given an explanation that wasn't an assertion of authority, and the first time she had seen, for a very brief instant, something like genuine concern on his face. The event that changed the dynamic between them was a business dinner Khalid had organized for a group of international investors, an event Layla had discovered through Hessa, the maid, and to which she had not been formally invited. She had appeared anyway, wearing one of the dresses she had found in the quarter's closet, and which she had adjusted with available resources, because she had decided that invisibility was a choice she was no longer willing to make. Khalid had seen her enter the room, and there had been a flash of something in his eyes that lasted less than a second, before being replaced by his usual composure. He had approached her discreetly and said in a low voice, "You didn't need to do this." She had replied, also in a low voice, with a smile that was public enough for the guests around, "I needed to do exactly this." And then she had turned to the nearest group and initiated a conversation about sustainability in the Gulf textile industry, with a fluency that had surprised at least 3 of the investors present, 2 of whom had asked for her contact before the night was over. Khalid had observed this from a distance of 2 meters, with an expression that Layla, upon briefly crossing eyes with him between one conversation and another, had identified with a precision that left her uncomfortable. Admiration. Not the distant and calculated admiration of someone evaluating an asset. It was something else. It was the recognition of someone seeing a person for the first time and understanding there was much more there than he had supposed. It was a look she hadn't expected to receive from him, and it had stayed with her, bothersome and insistent, long after the dinner had ended and the lounge lights had gone out. That dawn, Layla woke up at 3 in the morning with a thought that had arrived with the clarity of thoughts that come when consciousness is between sleep and wakefulness, without the usual defenses. She was beginning to see Khalid as a person, not as a symbol of everything she had tried to escape, not as the representative of a structure that had suffocated her choices, but as a specific individual with his own history and wounds he hadn't learned to treat any other way. This didn't change anything that had been wrong. It didn't justify anything, but it complicated everything in a way she would need to examine carefully, because complications of this kind, she knew, were the most dangerous. She stared at the ceiling until dawn, and when the sun began to enter through the crack in the curtain with that honey-colored light, exclusive to the desert at that hour, she had made a decision. She would ask for a conversation with Khalid. A real conversation, not about rules or freedom of movement, but about what the two were to each other, about what was possible to build and what definitely was not. It was a frightening conversation. It was also, she realized, the only conversation that really mattered. The conversation Layla had planned was postponed by an event that was not in either of their plans. A delegation of members from the Al-Farsi clan had arrived at the palace for a meeting that Khalid clearly hadn't anticipated with pleasure, judging by the visible tension in the way he had crossed the main corridor that morning. Layla had witnessed the visitors' arrival from the upper floor balcony. 6 men of mature age, with grave expressions and formal clothing, being received in the main atrium with the impeccable protocol the palace maintained for heavyweight visits. Hesse, always discreet and always informed about palace movements in a way that seemed a natural talent, had explained in a whisper that afternoon that the Al-Farsi clan was a family with whom the Al-Rashids had a long and not entirely peaceful history, marked by agreements that had benefited both sides in moments of convenience, and by disputes that had reopened old tensions at other times. Their presence there, without prior notice, had a symbolic weight that Hesse didn't need to fully explain for Layla to understand. That night's dinner had been formal and tense. Layla had been included at the head table, a decision that had clearly been Khalid's, and which she had interpreted as a gesture serving multiple purposes at once. To show the visitors that the situation of the wife who had fled was resolved, to reaffirm an image of domestic stability that was politically convenient, and, paradoxically, to place her in a position that gave her visibility and a voice at a table where her absence would have been commented upon. The leader of the Al-Farsi delegation was a man named Hamad, with white hair and small eyes that observed everything with the measured attention of someone who spent decades in negotiation rooms. He had spoken with Layla during dinner with a cordiality she had immediately recognized as a test, not a compliment. He had asked questions about her family background, about her years of study, about her opinions on the regional luxury goods market, and had listened to each answer with that calculated attention before moving to the next question. At coffee time, when the men had retired for more private conversations and the women accompanying the delegation had formed their own group, Hamad had approached Khalid and said something in a low voice that Layla hadn't heard completely, but she had caught enough words to understand it had to do with her. Khalid had replied briefly and changed the subject with the efficiency of someone closing a line of conversation without leaving an opening. Later, when the visitors had already retired to the quarters designated for them, Layla had found Khalid on the upper floor balcony where she usually stayed at night. He was with his back to the door, looking at the garden, with the medallion in his open hand. There was something in his posture different from his usual composure, an involuntary relaxation that seemed to emerge only when he didn't know he was being watched. She had stood at the threshold for a moment, without announcing her presence, and in that moment she had seen clearly and without the mediation of their daily tensions what Amira had intuited before her, that there was within that man a loneliness as old as any of the palace walls, and which had been built not by choice but by a series of losses and expectations that had molded him in a direction that was not, she now felt with some certainty, the only one that existed in him. Khalid had turned and seen her. The two had stayed in a silence different from all the other silences they had shared, because it wasn't tense. It was just honest enough to discomfort both equally. She had taken a step onto the balcony and said, "Hamad said something about me." It hadn't been a question. Khalid had put away the medallion and replied after an instant, "He said I had made a good marriage, that you were a woman of substance." Layla had waited for a continuation that didn't come. Then she had asked, "And what did you say?" Khalid had looked at her with that look she had identified at the investors' dinner, but which was now more direct, without an audience to justify any performance. I said I agreed. It was the first genuinely simple thing he had said to her since the beginning of everything. No protocol, no strategic positioning, without the careful construction of authority that permeated every previous interaction. And it was exactly that simplicity that made Layla feel the ground slightly unstable under her feet, in the specific way that happens when something a person had decided to categorize one way begins to resist that categorization. She had said good night and returned to her quarters before anything else could be said, because there were words that, once spoken, change the contour of everything that comes after, and she still didn't know if she was ready for that kind of change. That night, alone in the room, she had opened the memory card and looked at the fashion projects she had developed over years. There was one in particular, a collection inspired by the geometry of Bedouin fabrics, reinterpreted with modern, sustainable materials, which had stalled 2 years ago for lack of connections with suppliers in the region. She had spent 2 hours working on it with an intensity that was part work and part escape, but which had produced at the end of those 2 hours 3 development pages that were the best she had written for that project. and she had stayed looking at those pages thinking that maybe, just maybe, life was more complicated than the categories she had built to protect herself. And that complicated was not necessarily the same as wrong. The next morning, Tariq al-Mansouri woke up in his apartment in Sharjah and passed the street of Bab al-Ward Cafe before going to the office, as he had done every day since Layla had disappeared. Nadia was on the sidewalk outside watering the plants and greeted him with a wave. He stopped and asked again, more because he needed to hear it than because he expected a different answer. This time, Nadia looked at him for a moment, with an expression that weighed something. Then she said, "She's fine, she just isn't here. She just isn't." Tariq stayed silent for a moment, processing the way Nadia had said that, the specific care in that sentence that said much more than the words contained. Then he nodded, thanked her, and followed along the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and the black-covered notebook under his arm, trying to understand why those 4 words, "she is fine," had left him with a sensation that was at once relief and something more complex, something that had no clear name but which he knew, with the honesty of someone who has written for years about human emotions, was loss. There was something about that woman he had observed for weeks without ever having the courage to initiate a real conversation beyond functional counter-politeness. And now she was gone and he remained, and there was the nagging suspicion that he had lost something he had never actually had, but which had been, nonetheless, real. The revelation arrived in a way neither of them had planned, on a Sunday morning when the palace was quieter than usual, because most of the staff had left for the weekly meeting at the nearby mosque, and the Al-Farsi visitors had departed the day before. Layla was in the library working on the Bedouin collection when she found by accident, while looking for a photographic reference in one of the albums on the upper shelves, a black-covered notebook that had fallen from behind a row of books, and which, when she picked it up from the floor, opened to a page that made her stop completely. It was a collection of sketches, fashion sketches, fabrics reinterpreted from traditional Arabic patterns, fluid lines that mixed the structure of the abaya with contemporary silhouettes, notes in Arabic in the margin that she read slowly, recognizing technical terms from her same field. The handwriting was feminine, careful, and there was a date on the first page 7 years ago. She stared at those sketches for a long time, feeling something shift in what she had believed she knew about the palace and about Khalid. Then she closed the notebook carefully and held it in her hands, trying to understand what that meant and who it had belonged to. Khalid entered the library 20 minutes later with a cup of coffee, the recent habit of bringing coffee to her when he passed the door having established itself without either of them commenting. He saw the notebook in her hands and stopped. The silence was of a different kind from all they had shared before. It was the silence of someone seeing something they had kept in a safe place in the hands of another person and calculating what that changes. Layla raised her eyes to him and said, "Whose sketches are these?" Khalid placed the cup on the table with a controlled gesture and stood for a moment before sitting in the chair across from her. The medallion was visible over his kandura, as happened sometimes when he was at home, out of a formal context. She had learned to read that detail as a sign that there was something below the surface that hadn't yet reached her. He said, "Dahlias." The name had come out with a weight that needed no explanation to be felt. Layla stayed silent, waiting. Khalid stared at the notebook for a moment. Then he began to speak with a cadence different from his usual, slower, like someone choosing words he rarely uses. Dahlia had been his fiancée 6 years ago. They had met through families, but it had been different from a typical arrangement. It had been a choice they both had made with genuine will. Dahlia had been a designer, a person with real talent and projects he had tried to support financially, but never managed to support the way she had needed, which was with presence, with attention, with the ability to see the person beyond the function she fulfilled within the structure of his life. Dahlia had left a year before the wedding. She had left the medallion with a letter saying he was a man of great capacity for everything except for being present. That there was beside him a loneliness that wasn't geographical or material, but of another kind, the kind that happens when a person looks at you and sees only what you can offer, never who you are when you aren't offering anything. Khalid had read that letter so many times he had already memorized every word, and he had kept the medallion not as punishment for himself as he had initially thought, but because he had eventually realized it was the most honest thing someone had said to him in his entire adult life, and he needed to have it close so as not to forget. The marriage to Layla had been arranged 2 years later, in a period when he had tried to do something his advisors and family had been asking for years: to be practical, to take on the responsibilities of a sheik of his position. To no longer wait for something he had learned in a painful way might not be possible for him. And then Layla had arrived, and had left on the same night, and had looked at him from across a cafe counter in Sharjah with eyes that didn't ask or fear, and had said that work was no one's concession, and had appeared at a business dinner without being invited, and had spoken about textile sustainability with a fluency that had left investors impressed and had left him with a sensation that took days to identify: hope. The specific, almost forgotten sensation that there was something there that could be real if he learned, this time, to be truly present. Layla heard all this in silence. When he finished, there was a silence different from all others in the room, a silence that wasn't tense or calculated, but just the necessary space between an important thing said and another important thing yet to be said. She looked at the notebook in her hands and then at him. She said, "Did you know I was a designer when my father presented the agreement?" Khalid looked at her directly and said, "No, I found out later. And when I found out, I understood that another mistake was being made, but this time I had allowed it." She was silent for a moment, processing that. Then she said slowly, "What do you want from me, Khalid? Not what the agreements say, not what the family expects. What do you want?" It was a question he clearly hadn't prepared an answer for, and which had found him without the usual defenses, and he stayed silent for a time that was too honest to be discomfort, and which ended when he said, with a voice that was the simplest she had heard from him, "I want to have the chance to be the person who sees you, not what you represent, you." And there was the crack that had begun days ago transformed into a real opening, and Layla looked at it with all the complexity of what she had lived in recent months, with all the reasons not to believe, and with that small and insistent part that had remained standing even when everything seemed a reason to give up, and said, "That isn't enough alone, but it is an honest start." There was still much to resolve between them. There were entire structures that needed to be dismantled and rebuilt on different bases. There were difficult conversations still ahead, about freedom and choice, and what a true partnership meant. But at that moment, in a library smelling of paper and with 2 cups of coffee cooling on the table, there was also the concrete sensation that the ground under both their feet was more solid than it had been at any previous moment. In the days following that conversation in the library, something had changed in the palace, in a way that wasn't spectacular, but was perceptible to anyone who paid attention. Khalid had begun to ask Layla's opinion on issues he never would have taken to her before. Not as protocol, but as a genuine habit of someone learning that another perspective is not a threat, but a resource. Layla had begun to accept the workspace he had offered weeks ago, not as a concession, but because she had understood the difference between accepting something from someone who wants to control and accepting something from someone who is trying to learn to offer without conditions. And there was an afternoon when Khalid had passed by the workspace, where she was developing the Bedouin collection, and had stayed looking at the sketches on the wall with real, not polite attention, and had said there was a supplier of natural fibers in Ras Al Khaimah with whom he had contact and who might interest her. Layla had raised her eyes from the fabrics and looked at him for a moment, evaluating, and then had said, "Give me his contact." It was the first time she had asked him for anything with that direct and unqualified tone, and it was, of all the things that had happened between them, perhaps the clearest that said she had decided to stay, not for lack of option, but by choice. And Khalid had written the contact on a paper and left it on the table, and went away without saying anything else, because he had learned, slowly, that sometimes the right thing to do was exactly that, to leave space. 3 months later, the collection Layla had internally called Roots of the Wind was presented at a small and carefully selected event at a cultural space in Abu Dhabi, organized by an association of emerging Gulf designers. It hadn't been a large-scale debut. It hadn't been the kind of launch that filled pages of international magazines. It had been exactly what she had chosen, a start made on her own terms, with her own contacts, with her own name on the invitation. Khalid had arrived without warning he was going, which she had discovered only when she saw him in a chair at the back of the room, without visible security, with that expression of concentrated attention she had learned to recognize as the most genuine way he inhabited any space. He hadn't spoken to her during the event. He had listened to the presentation, had observed the fabrics, had stayed longer than any other guest before a specific piece, the one using reinterpreted Bedouin geometry in natural fiber provided by the Ras Al Khaimah contact, and had left without ceremony. That night, back at the palace, there was a card on her workspace table. Inside, in the small handwriting she had learned to recognize as his, there was only one sentence: "Dahlia would have liked to meet you." Layla had stayed holding that card for a long moment. Then she had placed it on the table next to the sketch of the next collection, and had stayed looking at the two, the card and the sketch, thinking there was something in that combination that was, for the first time in a long time, completely hers. Amira had received a message through Rania that same week, with a code the two had agreed upon on the day of the escape. The message said only that she was well, that she had chosen to stay and that the choice had been hers. Amira had read the message twice and then folded the phone, returned to work in the palace kitchen with her feet firm on the ground and her eyes slightly shining, and hadn't said anything to anyone because there are things that don't need words to be completely real. Tariq had published a short story that season in a literary magazine in the Emirates. The central character was a woman who worked in a cafe and who had one day simply gone away, and there was a scene where the narrator stayed at the table near the window, looking at the place where she used to be, and realized that what he felt in that empty space was the specific weight of a person who had occupied a place so completely that her absence had its own shape. The story had been well received. Tariq had returned to Bab al Ward a few times after that, not looking for anyone, but because the coffee was good and the table near the window had a light that helped him write.